Tensions regarding the slavery issue reached a boiling point on October 16, 1859. That evening, 22 men, led by noted abolitionist John Brown, raided the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. An arsenal is a military weapons and munitions storage facility. John Brown had previously made a name for himself in Kansas, where, along with his sons, killed 5 slavery supporters and helped lead armed resistance against slavery. At Harper's Ferry, Brown's goal was to incite a slave rebellion. Brown hoped that by seizing the weapons, local African Americans would flock to the arsenal and an uprising against slave owners could commence. However, no slaves or free African Americans joined with Brown and his men. The local militia, however, did respond and it succeeded in surrounding Brown's men. On October 19th, U.S. troops, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, recaptured the arsenal. Brown and a few survivors were tried and executed for their attempts to provoke a slave rebellion. Immediately following the raid, Northerners and some abolitionists attempted to distance themselves from Brown and his raid by speaking out against his actions. However, as the trial progressed, Brown's behavior and courage won over many in the North. Brown gave a speech following his sentencing in which he accepted the consequence for fighting for those who, in his words, rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments. Leading up to his execution, there were numerous pleas to spare Brown's life. French novelist Victor Hugo wrote an open letter to the American public claiming that the execution of Brown would be an uncorrectable sin. Despite many people disapproving of Brown's actions, his firm stance in opposing slavery, which many felt was wrong, made him a hero and a martyr. In the South, however, Brown was seen as a terrorist. His actions at Harper's Ferry intensified Southern fears that abolitionists intended to incite large-scale armed slave rebellions. In response, the South suspected abolitionists were attacked and sometimes even killed. The 1860 presidential election epitomized the sectional divisions in the nation. Abraham Lincoln won the Republican Party nomination for president. The Democratic Party, which was split along sectional lines, remained divided when it came time to nominate a candidate for president. The party ended up actually having 2 nominees, one nominated by the Northern Democrats, who was Stephen Douglas, and another nominated by the Southern Democrats. His name was John C. Breckinridge. Another party developed called the Constitutional Party. They nominated John Bell, who was a former slave owner from the state of Tennessee. The Constitutional Party's goal was to save the Union, but they actually took no official stance on slavery. Lincoln ended up winning only 39% of the popular vote. However, he also won enough electoral college votes to claim victory. Abraham Lincoln claimed victory despite not appearing on the ballots in some southern states. And although Lincoln explicitly stated that while he opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, he did not intend to act against it in places where it already existed. And however, many Southerners still saw the election of a Republican as an immediate threat to the institution of slavery. Some Southern states did not wait to see what actions Lincoln would take once he was sworn into office. South Carolina was the first to take action when on December 20th, 1860, they seceded from the Union. To secede means to leave the country. By February 1861, 6 more states followed South Carolina's lead and left the Union. Those states were Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. 4 more states, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, left the Union once fighting broke out in the spring of 1861. However, 4 slave states chose to remain in the Union and never seceded from the United States. Those states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, were the most northern of the slave states and would become known as the border states. 1861 did see the inclusion of a new state to the Union, though. Kansas was finally admitted into the United States as a free state. Additionally, in 1863, 2 years into the war, the northern counties of Virginia chose to secede from the state and rejoin the Union. Those counties became the state of West Virginia. The southern states that chose to leave the Union came together in order to form a new country. In February of 1861, the, at the time, 7 seceding states came together to form the Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy or the CSA. Jefferson Davis was appointed the president of the Confederacy. Additionally, the delegates at this convention drafted their own constitution, which was nearly identical to the United States Constitution, except that it specifically protected slavery. In the early months of 1861, when Southern states were leaving the Union and forming their own country, President Buchanan failed to take any action to slow or to prevent the actions taking place in the South. Rather, Buchanan left any actions regarding saving the Union up to the incoming President Lincoln. One key impending crisis that Buchanan failed to act upon were the events unfolding at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a U.S. military fort located in the middle of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. South Carolina viewed the presence of federal troops in the fort as a foreign occupation in their nation. From December of 1860 through April of 1861, South Carolina repeatedly demanded that the president, first Buchanan and then Lincoln, surrender the fort. Attempts to resupply the fort with troops, weapons, and food were repeatedly repelled. After Lincoln became president, it became clear that the troops at Fort Sumter, led by Major Robert Anderson, were rapidly running low on food. Lincoln could not give up the fort as it would be perceived as accepting the legitimacy of an independent South Carolina. But likewise, he needed to ensure that whatever actions he took could not be perceived as aggressive. So Lincoln chose to send an unarmed naval ship to resupply the fort with food, and he made it clear that is all that he was doing. In response, on April 9th, Jefferson Davis issued a demand that Major Anderson surrender. Anderson, of course, refused. On April 12th, Confederate forces in Charleston, commanded by General P.T. Beauregard, began an artillery bombardment of the fort. The following day, Anderson was forced to surrender the fort. On April 15th, with hostilities clearly underway now, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to join the Union Army. The Confederate attack on Union forces angered Northerners who quickly rushed to fill Lincoln's request. The attack on Fort Sumter marked the beginning of the Civil War.